Welcome everybody who's logging on. We'll be starting in 2 minutes. As you're waiting, please feel free to check out who else is in the room with us by scrolling through the participant list. And also we invite you to check out the poll that we have up to the right of where you see the video screen. There's some polling questions, so please feel free to respond to those so we get a sense of who's in the room. All right, my friends, shall we dive in? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Welcome to our UN World Data Forum session on balancing data use and data protection, with a particular focus on learning lessons from African experiences. This session is part of thematic area 5, which is focused on building trust in data and statistics. And my name is Sarah Lucas from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. I'll be your moderator today, and I have the great pleasure of co-hosting this session with Al Caggs and his incredible team at the Open Institute in Kenya. Wave, Al, say hello to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. So our session today refers to this notion of balancing data protection and data use. And I encourage us as we move through this conversation to think fairly broadly about data governance. So what do we mean by data governance? Well, data protection might be the realm of specific authorities or specific legal agreements. Data governance is a much broader concept. It is the realm of many actors in society, and it refers broadly to a set of laws, policies, norms, and authorities that guide how governments make decisions with data, how they use data, and very importantly, how citizens benefit from government use of data, and also how citizens have their privacy protected in that process. So data governance is not a new issue, but there's several trends in our world right now which are making it all the more important to focus on. And the first, of course, is COVID. The COVID pandemic has brought data into the spotlight like never before. It's more important than ever, and important in understanding how the pandemic is spreading. It's important in mitigating its impacts and understanding its impacts. And many countries are taking what's being called the digital first approach, which is relying on digital tools to respond to the pandemic because of social distancing requirements or because of just the urgency and need for timely information and data. And so much of the data that's being collected is quite personal in nature. So this discussion around data governance has really been accelerated in the context of COVID. Secondly, unfortunately, in many of our countries, there is a widespread campaign of disinformation and misinformation that's just creating a toxic and contested political environment where there's dispute over the credibility of facts and data, and there's just an overall spirit of distrust. So it makes it very hard to understand where the truth is in any given discussion, making data governance and trust in data all the more important. So the time really is now to deepen our understanding of data governance and to take action around data governance. So whether you are someone who is a data protection professional or a privacy professional, maybe you come to this discussion from a human rights perspective, maybe you're a statistician, or maybe you're a data for development advocate, there's room for you in this conversation because all of you are members of societies that are grappling with norms and policies around how to use data. And that's what we're talking about today. But unlike many conversations around data governance that center on European countries because of the groundbreaking GDPR, or that focus on big tech firms that are in the news all the time, this conversation is centered on Africa. We are bringing African expertise and African experiences into a global conversation about data governance. So we are joined today by 5 extraordinary experts from across the continent, each with very different perspectives on this topic. They sit in different places of society. And so before I begin and listen to these wonderful people, I just want to give a huge thanks to the UN World Data Forum Secretariat team for their extraordinary work to pull off this forum and for their help with this session, and also to the Open Institute team, who has helped make this session not only possible, but I expect it to be quite great. All right, so I'd like to draw your attention to a couple things in Attendify before we dive in. First, of course, is the chat function. So this is where we're going to ask you to put your questions in for the speakers. We'll pull together your questions and bring your voices into the conversation. And the second function is a polling function. You'll see an opportunity. There's 3 little bars there next to the chat function, next to the participants. Please feel free to answer those polls so we get a sense of who is in the room and who is with us today. All right, we are going to dive in. For our first round of conversation, what I'm going to do is ask each of our speakers to just tell us a story. We're trying to get some of the main issues on the table here. Let's start with concrete stories and experiences from across the continent. So I'm going to ask each of the speakers to give us a concrete story that illustrates some of the issues around data governance that are playing out in their countries or contexts or sectors. So to get us started, I'm going to actually move from west to east across the continent to this part of the discussion. We're going to start in Ghana with Teki Akwete Falconer. Teki is a lawyer by training. She is the founder and executive director of the Africa Digital Rights Hub. She was the very first executive director of the Data Protection Commission in Ghana. So very well positioned to get us started in the conversation today. So Teki, please, over to you for your story.
Thank you, Sarah. So I find this story very interesting, and it relates to how the Ghana Statistical Service, have actually embraced data governance, even though they may not necessarily call it that, in their decision making, especially around the COVID and around access to call data records. So the Ghana Statistical Service, interestingly, happened to have been one of the key agencies that had an arrangement with a telco player on access and use of core data records. And this had happened during the Ebola breakout. Of course, with COVID happening as well, the importance of use of this data has altogether become more relevant, and there's been calls for the use of the data. What I found very interesting is that they went ahead and set up a whole steering committee and a task force that was constituted with many different skill sets, statisticians, people within industry, and even not-for-profit organizations, to take decisions around what kind of information can be accessed, how the information can be accessed, and who can come to them to access the information. I'm sharing this story because I thought it was very groundbreaking. And even though they did not necessarily call it a data governance, I realized that that's exactly what they were doing. The processing, the transparency around it, the structure within which decision was being made, and everything else that went through those processes. So I thought this was a very, very good place to start from, to really share this story from the Ghana Statistical Service. And if they are listening to me, I think that was a very good thing that they did, and I hope that they continue to do that. Another exciting thing about it is that they brought everyone that mattered to the table. They brought a civil society, they brought the technology providers that had the data. They also had government agencies that were going to play other roles in the access and use of the data. And it was a very rich, combination of experts and people and views, to all come together in taking this decision. And I think that's a very good approach when we are talking about data governance.
Teki, I love that story because it illustrates perfectly this notion of shared decision-making across not owned by one authority or entity within the government, but shared decision-making across the government with transparency to the public. That's a really beautiful example of what data governance can look like. So thank you so much for sharing that story. We're going to move next to Kenya. Al, I'm coming to you next. Al Kaggs is the founder and director of the Open Institute in Kenya, our co-host today. And Al has spent much of his professional life leading open data and open government initiatives in Kenya and beyond. So Al, tell us how you've come to this data governance topic from the open data perspective and what story you'd like to share.
I'm really excited to be here, and thank you, Sarah, for masterfully leading this session. Now, the story that I think I would like to tell is, so we have been working on open data and trying to figure out how to support governments for quite a while in terms of making sure that they can use data successfully. So we were quite excited that at some point in the history of the country, Kenya got into a situation where they were going to start to register citizens, do a civil registration exercise so that everybody gets one number. The idea behind it is awesome because of the fact that what it says is that everybody gets to get one number that can help them, kind of like your Social Security in the US. Now, what then happened is that the government went and started to threaten people and made it a serious, a seriously fearful issue, because what they said was that if you are not going to sign up for the Huduma number, which is what it is called, a service number, if you're not going to sign up for the Huduma number, then we will take away your M-Pesa, which is, for those of you that know Kenya, we pioneer in mobile money transactions. So a lot of Kenyans actually keep all of their money within their M-Pesa. And suddenly government says, if you do not sign up for for the Huduma number, then you're not going to be able to transact any money. But the resistance behind it has been that there has been worry that people will not be able to, govern themselves or be part of the solution because of the fact that there's so much fear around it. And it brought into our minds the idea of the authoritarian era that we went through. So what I'm trying to say here is that one of the ways that government has been dealing with, or governments around the world has been dealing with governing data has been through fear, through authoritarianism. And it's something that we now have to be a little more attentive to because of the fact that trust is a really important component of making sure that we succeed where data is concerned.
Thank you so much for this story. I think it's one of the illustrations that we're seeing in a lot of countries of a move towards digitalization and digital transformation that expands the reach of government right up into your life much more immediately. And if you have a beneficial experience with your government, that might be a positive thing. And if you already have a nervous authoritarian relationship with your government, that might be unsettling. And it's just important. Remember, in Kenya, the rollout of Huduma number was there wasn't a data protection law in place to govern how those data might be used, right? And so the sequencing there was off such that there wasn't any framework to provide a sense of reassurance for folks about how those data would be used as well. So you've raised something really important, the tensions that are emerging in societies and these kinds of public debates that happen, the norms that must be at play in societies as governments move towards digitalization and increased use of data. So thank you for sharing that story. We're going to stay in Kenya for a moment and turn to Arungu Houghton, who is Executive Director of Amnesty International in Kenya. And Arungu, many of you probably know, has had executive leadership roles in many international development organizations. He's a global leader on many issues related to global development and now human rights. He was at Oxfam and ActionAid for years. So Arungu, welcome. As a development professional who is now focused on human rights, tell us the lens through which you see this topic and a story from Kenya or elsewhere in the region that you think illustrates some of the key issues.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, perhaps, to those of 71 of you that are on this call, which I can see. So I'm going to tell you a story about the census, and it's the 2019 census. So roughly about a year ago, somewhere around August in 2019, we were preparing for our national census. And of course, the National Housing and Population Census is critical. It's the foundation for all development programming. For human rights organizations, we understand that it is the basis upon which socioeconomic rights will be realized or not, and marginalized groups will be counted or not, or will count or not. In Kenya, there have been about 6 censuses since 1948. And of course, they're on a 10-year cycle like other parts of the world. So this is the moment, and really. So a few months before the census was about to run, the government or the National Assembly passed a new Official Statistics Act. And in many ways, that act was a very important departure from the last 13 years of essentially managing statistics through the Official Secrets Act. So many of us were quite excited about it. We knew that the new amendments essentially gave the National Bureau of Statistics professional independence from state agencies and other ministries. It had great principles on the right to public information, the confidentiality of individual data, and really compliance with best practices internationally. Now, at the time the story, that the Huduma number exercise was happening and the census was being carried out, we had no Data Protection Act in place. We had a bill that was sitting in Parliament, but it was not ready. But this was going to be the first census in the history of Kenya that would be conducted through internet-ready mobile tablets. So on one hand, wonderful opportunity, new law. We have a great set of digital, a huge digital leap for the country. And we prepared for this. 3 days before the census is about to roll out, a tweet came across my timeline. And that tweet had photographs of questions P60, P61, and 62. This will mean nothing to you, those of you outside of Kenya, but they became really important questions. And these questions essentially asked people to identify themselves in terms of whether they received a Huduma number, and secondly, whether they had a national identity card number, and thirdly, asked them to indicate their passport or their national ID figures. Now, for those of you who are statisticians, you will know that these are essentially verifiable data and unique identifiers, which renders an anonymous exercise like the census redundant. Secondly, that by the numerators coming to your house with digitally enabled tablets that are GPS coordinated, not only would government then have up to about 63 points of data on every person who went through this exercise, but they would be able to indicate where they lived. And this is not just Kenyans, this is every living human being with a pulse in the Republic of Kenya on that 21st of August. So what do we do with this as a human rights organization? Do we essentially just ignore it? Because obviously it has violated the Official Statistics Act. It has gone right into people's privacy. And thirdly, it is, after all, the census, right? So we debated about having a statement, essentially condemning this. And eventually we resolved that we would do an advisory to the nation. And we had 12, I think it was 10 things that you needed to know about the census. And the most important part of that was the fact that you have a right, it's actually a civic obligation to participate in the census. We think it's very important as Amnesty. Secondly, it is your right to participate and to be counted, because if you're not counted, you definitely will not receive your rightful share of the budget. And thirdly, you also have the right to remain anonymous. And we explained to Kenyans that by participating in this exercise, you are giving away your right to remain anonymous in this exercise. Now, the response was viral. From everything to ministers calling my phone and asking me, what are you doing? Are you trying to disrupt a 10-year-old, a process that only happens every 10 years? To porn websites being dropped on our timelines, both our social media platforms. Our website went down for a couple of days, and we had to set up a helpline, because what was happening was people were being asked essentially to were being intimidated to actually go through this process. Let me just say that quite a number of people have called us, and we gave them advice that they were under no legal obligation to participate in this, and perhaps just an indication of how our confidence as a team was destroyed by the manipulation of essentially a very valuable exercise. There was no Amnesty staff member that participated in the census, sadly.
Wow, Arungu, that is such a powerful story. I think every country can relate to the notion of the census. We're all going through it. And one of the things I really like about this story is that it illustrates, you know, we so often see in these debates about data governance kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, right? There's the folks who really believe that data are the savior, that data is the panacea, every development challenge can be solved with data, or there's people who are oriented only around data protection and data privacy. And you are, in your embodiment and in your institution, recognizing the value of both of those things. And I read your message about the census. It was both filled with the essential nature of having census data for 10 years of government decision making and the real threat to privacy and personal security, all in one moment, all in one, you know, in yourself, you felt that tension. And so it's really important illustration of the kinds of tensions that are playing out in countries across the continent. So thank you for sharing that story. I'm going to turn next to Ethiopia, though Oliver is actually from Zambia, so we're turning both east and south simultaneously. Oliver Chinganya is a statistician at the Africa Center for Statistics at the UN Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa. Oliver, over to you from the perspective of a statistician and also sitting in a regional entity. Tell us a story that you believe really underscores some of the main issues associated with data governance.
Thank you, Sarah, for organizing this, and good morning and good afternoon, colleagues that are connected on this platform. Let me just put things in context before I talk about any story that I have, and by saying that, let me say that everyone agrees that data is important and has value. It's like currency, and some people say it is like gold, and others have even called it a new iron. It's basically simply an asset, if you want to put it that way. So there is a lot of interest around data, and therefore there must be rules on how it's managed and how it is used by everyone for everyone. And this is why, for us who work for the UN and many others that are part of the official statistics, I know the UN fundamental principles of official statistics are in place, along with the statistical laws, others call them acts, or the Statistical Code of Ethics. In Africa, we also have what we call the African Charter on Statistics, so that no one is abused, or no one abuses the numbers, or feels abused through the numbers. So just to give you a little bit of a story that I have is that I'm going to be reflecting on one of the countries that we work with. And I'm not going to name that country, where the statistical law was actually revised or amended to strengthen the coordination authority of the national statisticians for very good reasons, very good intentions. However, you know, when you look at the law very clearly, you see that, you know, it was over the mandates the national statistician to approve all statistical information prior to publication. Basically, anyone who wants to publish or has to get approval from the national statistician. The law also provides for the national statistician to control the information disseminated and research activities. Now, when you look at these requirements within the law, they can actually be easily misunderstood, meaning limiting work of other agencies that are producing data, including suggesting that only official statistics produced by the National Statistical Office should actually be published. This could lead for eroding of trust on official statistics and also block research in statistics. It could also, what one would say, maybe constrain the work and the value of independent statistics that are outside the scope of official statistics. Many actors, when this act was, this statistical law was reviewed, raised a lot of concern, including development partners, the UN agencies, and people within the country were actually very concerned with the amendments. I must mention that, however, that the situation now has been addressed with further regulatory changes, and everyone now is happy with the new Statistical Act. And this just shows to show that, you know, data governance is critical. And let me just underscore that also statistical landscape has a lot of people that are actors in it. One would say the most populated areas where there are so many actors helping each other, trying to push themselves outside. And so forth, others that are credible, others that are not. But I think there is need for some kind of flexibility in the law, when you talk about governance, in the law, to make sure that it provides for and allows for other sources to be used, other agents that to be able to produce the data, as long as these sources are actually that, you know, appropriately acknowledged without having to step on toes of anyone. But again, here, I must mention that, you know, it's important to ensure that users must be free to use a source of their choice, especially if they require the data that needs to be used now. And also just to point out that, the National Statistical Offices, despite all the, the data that is available, I think it remains with the authority around official statistics, but must give room to other and must give room to other sources of data.
Thank you so much, Oliver, and that really underscores both this notion that there's a broad community of both data producers and users, that is the interaction among that community that really matters. And I like the example that you've given, because it kind of shows what over-governance can look like, a little bit too many restrictions on data use and participation, and needing to dial that back. Thank you. All right, let's turn now to Mauritius. We have with us, we're so honored to have with us Judesha Madoub, who is a lawyer by training, another lawyer. She has served as the Data Protection Commissioner in Mauritius since 2007, which, Judesha, I think that probably makes you one of the most, if not the most experienced data protection officer and commissioner on the continent. So we are so fortunate to have you. So please share with us a story from Mauritius.
Thank you, Sarah, dear panelists and dear audience and participants. I'm very happy to be with you today, and it's always a pleasure to participate in such sessions where data protection is being discussed. And I must say that I have many success stories from Mauritius, so please bear with me. I have a list, and actually where my office has been closely working on many projects which have been quite successful. So let me start, not to lose time. The first thing that we did, actually the Data Protection Office, we issued a set of guidelines, which I can't show you on screen. Well, yes, it just disappeared, that we issued in the context of the pandemic. And actually, we brought in some very nice data protection principles that can be used instantly to promote data protection in such an emergency situation where normally, human rights are trumped over and there is abuse and public emergency situation. But in Mauritius, with this guidance, actually, which has been used by many, actors involved in the containment, they have very much inspired themselves from this document, and we didn't have many challenges with regard to data protection implementation. First of all, one success is contact tracing, is still being done manually, and we're not using digital tools or mobile apps to actually, try to see how to combat the pandemic. And the personal data of all COVID-19 patients are not being shared by the government with the public. And to protect the privacy rights of individuals and the secrecy obligations of medical practitioners. This is by way of law. It's contained in the regulations which we call the Prevention and Mitigation of Infectious Disease Regulations 20, which was passed since March in Mauritius as a matter of emergency. And again, in these regulations, there is a set of section provisions on data protection. For example, what is the type and nature of information that is gathered by a medical practitioner from a COVID-19 potential patient or patient. And these are actually only the basic details, the name and the person, or the person, his address, and actually samples. So as you can see, there has been a sort of minimalistic approach here, data minimization principle being applied in this context, where not all information relating to the patient is being actually collected. Only those necessary information that are required for the treatment of the person, that is actually being recorded. So this is a very big battle that the Data Protection Office, through the regulations, won. And this is the first battle that we won. The second battle is another section that is in the regulations on the restrictions and conditions imposed after a screening assessment by a medical practitioner on a patient. And all these restrictions have to be necessary and proportionate. As you can see, again, one very important principle in data protection being the necessity and proportionality principles have been respected in law. And this is a second battle that we won again. And the third battle that we won in these regulations since March is actually the right of the person, the patient, to be informed of the reason of his quarantine or isolation. Why is he being quarantined? What are actually the powers, the legal powers which allow this quarantine to take place? He has to be informed of this, and what steps are going to be taken and by whom in relation to him. So he's regularly being updated with all this information, and he's been informed of each and every detail concerning him. If this is not complied with, that is, the whole of the regulations are not complied with, including these sections, it is actually an offense being committed by the person collecting the data, the person processing the data. So you can see how far actually these regulations have gone to protect the privacy rights of people in Mauritius. And it has worked, because we haven't had many important cases where people have complained that their data have been misused. And this is actually the government's initiative, together with the Data Protection Office views that have been incorporated in these regulations. This is one big battle that we won. The second battle is another law, which is the COVID-19 Act 2020, which came into force in June 2020. And this particular COVID-19 Act covers all legislations that have been, contained or limited to be able to meet this emergency situation. And the only amendment that was brought to the Data Protection Act is such a minor amendment that I don't even think it's important for me to highlight it. That is, when actually the police is actually, during issuing a permit, a license, or an authorization to an institution to concerning COVID-19, people, like monitoring on streets, what are the details that you need to take from a person, a driver, for example. In this particular situation, only the Data Protection Act is not being applied. So you can see the whole gamut of the principles contained in our Data Protection Act are being applied and have never been suspended, even during the pandemic when it was still very alive. And Mauritius right now is not in a situation of emergency. So whatever emergency provisions have been taken, they are now not to say not in force, but they are not being applied because the virus has been contained in Mauritius. So as you can see now, we are back to normalcy, and the situation is, despite all these regulations that were taken to promote privacy during the pandemic, now we have the Data Protection Act being fully applied, and there is no such issue as a restriction being brought to the law itself. And there is one more battle I would like to highlight is the Ministry of Health. We have actually assisted them in devising what they call the Global Open ELIS Laboratory Information Management System. This is a centralized database containing all the information relating to COVID-19 patients. And we actually assisted them very closely in devising the principles that were to be contained, the privacy enhancing technologies that were to be maintained in the system for the rights of people to be protected. And this is being used now. Again, as I highlighted in the regulations before, it's just certain amount of information that are being contained in that database, like the name, the address, and the sample, the blood sample of the person. So that is the information that is contained in the database, and this is where we stand today. Another battle again is right now, they have set up what we call the Ministry of Health at the airport COVID laboratory to screen incoming passengers for COVID-19. Now this actually is, there is a memorandum of understanding that has been signed between the Ministry of Health and the airport national company, and the memorandum of understanding, again, under the supervision of this office, we have inserted a data protection clause. Let me read it to you. The parties herewith undertake to maintain the security and privacy of any personal data that they shall process or may come across in the discharge of their respective responsibilities under this MOU in strict compliance with the Data Protection Act and any other applicable law and regulations. You see again that this is a third battle that was won, where there is again strict compliance of data protection. Now, as I told you, we have issued a guide, and if you would want to have a look at this guide, I'm ready to share it with you and any other laws that have been quoted by me, and you can verify the authenticity of whatever I've been stating up to now. So I believe Mauritius has set up an example really for other countries, not only Africa, but other countries really to follow how to protect people's rights, especially privacy rights, during this very confusing situation. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Fidesha. And this story is so important because it shows how much flexibility and clarity you have in a crisis moment if you already have your principles clear, you already have your policy frameworks clear. And so I want to stay here with you for a minute, Fidesha, as we enter into the second round of questions. But before I do, let me just say to our participants and attendees, please put your questions in the chat in Attendify. That's easier for us to monitor than putting your chat and your questions directly into Zoom. So please take a moment if you can to put your questions there. We already see some coming in, including one for you, Fidesha. So I'm going to pile in my question for you together with what I'm seeing come in from the chat. But the fact that Mauritius you've had for many years your data protection legislation, policy framework, authorities in place, you have these principles very clear. So we want to understand a little bit about how we got there, because data protection legislation and data governance principles with any given country have to be relevant for your own national level. They have to be harmonized to some degree at the regional level and compliant at the global level. So there's a lot of things to align with. And so I'm curious how you manage that alignment at those three levels in Mauritius. And while I'm asking you to keep it short, I am going to pile on one other question, because this point that you raised, that you chose not to use a digital approach on contact tracing, is raising a lot of attention. And it's a really important principle here, which is just because you have a digital tool doesn't mean you use it. And part of the data governance discussion is this a proportional response? How are we going to use this information? And so that live discussion happened at Mauritius. And one of our wondering kind of what were the cost and benefit of that? Did you how effective was your contact tracing? It sounds like you haven't had a massive outbreak, but just what were the costs and benefits of that decision? So both how you're aligning at these three levels in your legislative approach, and also a quick comment, if you would, on the contact tracing.
Yes,
and we are going to try and keep it short.
Yes, sorry. I will just go on the last question that you just posed to me. How did we maintain manual contact tracing without going to use digital tools? Well, the question is that it's very country specific. We have a population of around 1.2 million. And Mauritius is just an island. It's like one city in the US. So basically what happened here, it was not that difficult to take the decision not to use digital tools at the start. Yes, indeed, we did have a massive outbreak of around, let's say, how many people? Like 300 cases. We started with 300 cases of people being infected with COVID. So we had to contain a situation starting with that and literally growing very rapidly to, let's say, 1,000 cases. But that we managed to contain because we have very good, I must say, health services in Mauritius, and which made it quite effective that we were able to bring these people that were infected under the right auspices of the hospitals concerned, the quarantine places. So everything was monitored right from the start, which actually why today is that we don't have the virus in Mauritius right now. So this is how we reached, because it was really a situation like any country, like there was an outbreak, but we contained it. But being the population, we're talking about a percentage in the population that was infected. So we were able to manage manual contact tracing. And I must say, because we were lucky in that. It's not because we were not forced in other situations, like in other countries, to actually go to digital tracing. If we did, then we should. I mean, but we didn't actually have to do that. So we were lucky in that context, and we were able to monitor the situation. So that is what I would like to say. But for me, like, I've been in this field for the past 14 years already. I started the data protection office in 2007 here, and I'm still in this position today. And our first data protection act relates to 2004, but which actually came into force in 2009. But my posting was made in 2007. I was actually preparing the ground for the office to come live and operational. So I've been in this for quite some years already. And I must say that now we have a second Data Protection Act, which is that of 2017, which came into force in 2018. I will come back to this when you are going to ask me the question on how at the regional level, national level, global level. If you want me to say it now, I can, but otherwise I can come back to how we actually updated our Data Protection Act to align with international principles, and how we made this a very friendly act happen in Mauritius. So up to you, Sarah.
Yeah, let's come back to that if you don't mind. I'd like to get some other voices in, but I don't know how the rest of you are feeling, but between your management of the virus and your data protection legislation and transparent decision making, I'm ready to move to Mauritius. You have us beat on every one of those fronts. Okay, I'd like to actually turn it to Oliver, because, you know, Oliver, not everybody can be Mauritius, apparently. And so I'm curious to hear, you know, UNECA has a role in supporting and guiding African governments. We know that there are more than 30 African countries that have data protection laws on the books, though fewer have kind of the authorities established, as the case is in Kenya right now. So tell us a little bit about how UNECA is able to support African governments in grappling with these complex data governance questions.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm also enticed to actually move to Ethiopia, Mauritius. It looks but to respond to your question, first of all, yeah, I think it's good to hear that there's as many African countries that have data protection laws. Perhaps the question is how they actually implement them. The data economy is diverse, as you know, and dynamic. The data requirements and timelines and most of the data do not actually conform to official statistics, the standards and norms and so forth. Therefore, the laws governing such data, both the traditional as well as the non-traditional, including big data and the verification. To respond, I just want to make that emphasis. And therefore, I think it is very difficult to have watertight data protection laws to effectively enforce them, especially in the digital data economy. It requires to regularly update the laws to ensure privacy of data is maintained, and that is not easily attainable in all data states that we have. And therefore, I think we need adaptive approaches due to the dynamic nature of the data economy. For us at ECA, working with partners within the organization, such as the African Union, the African Development Bank, we provide advisory services in 2 countries, statistical laws, and I'll come back to that a little much more deeper. And more recently, about a year ago, after we set up what we call the Digital Center for Excellence, ECA is engaged in supporting member states in designing the implementation of what one would call an inclusive national digital transformation strategy by adhering to principles and frameworks enshrined in the digital transformation strategy that was adopted by heads of states of ECA, to be precise, in February. So the African Center for Statistics, which I head at ECA, closely monitors the changes that takes place in the data ecosystem through various platforms. But in terms of the role that ECA and other regional and international organizations play in setting up standards and supporting countries, I must say that at the center, first of all, it plays a very major role on the continent as a UN body. First, it has a dual and unique role of being part of the global statistical system through the UN Statistical Commission, the coordinating committee of the statistical activities, the UN Committee of Chief Statisticians, which I actually belong to. And this entails us as ECA, as the Africa Center for Statistics, having to bring the discussion that takes place at the global level on statistics to the region. That's one part of the role. The second part of the role that ECA engaged itself is being part of the regional statistical system. Here, we do have what we call the Pan-African Statistical System. We have the African Statistical and also the Statistical Commission, which we just had a meeting last week, which engages the countries directly. So all these bodies, both at the regional as well as at the global level, where ECA and the other international organizations sit, deal with issues of setting standards, data standards, among others, including issues of governance, in line with the UN fundamental principles of official statistics, including how to deal with the issues in the realms of big data. So one of the three core functions of the ECA is capacity building. And that it means providing support to countries in a number of areas that on need basis. When there is demand, we go to support countries. And one of those areas is the issue that we are discussing today about data governance, which includes developing statistical roadmaps. And here I'm talking about the National Strategy for Development of Statistics. We are at the core, working with other partners to develop the NSDS, which are aligned to the national development plans as well as the budgeting processes. So in many cases, when a good strategy is actually developed, it would have the strategies and policies as well. But over and above, it is a consultative process, which involves all stakeholders here. We have the civil societies, the NGOs, the private sector, development partners, and agencies within the government with what we call the National Statistical System. So as part of implementing the NSDS, ECA works, of course, with the other agencies to assist countries to make sure that they conform to the international accepted methodologies, which is around the governance, and that will include concepts, standards in the area of statistics, developing of manuals, guidelines, which are regional specific without having to compromise the international statistical requirements. The second part, which is really the governance part of it, is the development or the revision or amendment of statistical laws or statistical acts, depends on how one wants to refer them to. So the Statistical Act or the statistical laws basically would be a guide of the collection. And I think you said it in the beginning when you talked about what data governance is about, how to share the data, how to use the data, to ensure that the citizens and other suppliers of data and the producers themselves are protected. Because it's both ways. It's just not the ones that are providing the data. Also, the ones that are providing the data or producing the data ought to be protected. And that means that the data that is used, to ensure that the data that is used is for the intended purposes by the government, and also and as well as other users like the citizens as well. Security and rights are reserved. So as ECA working with partners, this is at our core to make sure that the case I mentioned earlier on in my example in one of those countries is that we were part of the engagement to make sure that the act was actually amended to reflect the aspirations and desires of the citizens and other stakeholders, that none of them is infringed in terms of the privacy of data. So that is our role, and I think we play a very, very unique role in that sense, in that we bring this global discussion to the region and share through the many other platforms that we have with countries to ensure that they follow the international required methodology and standards. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Oliver. And I think that this notion of being a bridge to the global standards and the regional priorities and the national context is a really important function. So thank you for articulating that. I want to shift gears a little bit from, we've been talking with Judesha and Oliver kind of about frameworks and policies and practices. And I actually want to switch to Arungu and talk a little bit more about how we talk about these issues, how we conceive of data governance as a community. And one of the things that we've observed, or I've observed a little bit, is that data governance is a really broad topic. And people enter this topic through a lot of doors. Some people, as Judesha does, enters through a data protection lens. Some, as Al does, through an open data or data for development lens. There's others that focus on digital rights or internet freedoms or human rights. There's a big call for kind of the Human Rights Declaration applying to privacy and digital rights in particular. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective as a human rights and development expert, is it important that we have kind of more unified framing about how we talk about these issues, particularly as they relate to citizens? And if it is important to have more unified framing, can you offer one to us that you think is the most effective and useful?
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, that's a small question, given the time that we had. Let me just start by declaring I have not been invited to Mauritius by Judicia, but if I can be so presumptuous to say that I'm not moving to Mauritius until Kenya has a better data protection law and environment. But to come to your question, really, I think the nomenclature. First of all, we have to get this nomenclature, all these different doors that people enter this conversation through, are really far removed from the understanding of millions of data producers and data consumers, and that is, our people. And for many of them, it would really occur as a cacophony. I mean, I think if you ask that question to be standing in the middle of Nairobi on some street, I don't think people would even stop to hear my response. I think they would just keep moving. So I think the first thing we have to do is we have to figure out how to raise greater public awareness of the importance of data and why it is important to own that data as a human being. And secondly, even more importantly, how to lay legitimate claims on the state using that data. And I think that is critical. So it's neither a single narrative that we need to fight for or a binary of countervailing narratives, whether it's data protection or open data. It's really in the synergy of the concepts that I think that we find real clarity and focus. And the fact of the matter is while we struggle to get some common language, there are very powerful interests either in the state or almost grabbing this data, and in a way that I think is very corruption and the mismanagement of public resources. Public data is another form of an asset, to use one of our panelists' comments. So probably the language that I would use is rights-based, data-driven policy making and programming. I think that's would be a nice way of bringing the 2 or 3 or 5 different ends together. And the key thing for our constitutions across the international human rights remain analog. The world moves digital.
Oh, the rights-based, data-driven policy making. The main message here around really experience is an important one to deepen this conversation, because Arungu has pointed out, we tend to kind of have these conversations in elite circles, right? Or advocates or whatever, more accessible to citizens, more about citizens, more beneficial for citizens. And to Arungu's earlier point, not just citizens, but anybody living within the boundaries of a country that a government is responsible for serving. So over to you, Al.
The biggest issue is that, when we work in communities like here in Kenya and we speak to people within the community, we have learned that people don't know what data is. Every time we have to speak to community, we start by explaining what data is. So if you don't know what data is, then you don't know that there is rights to it. And then when government has even used data to provide services that are useful to communities or to the citizens, a lot of that is not actually connected so that citizens understand that has anything to do with data. So the fact that it is an elite thing requires for us to better communicate what data is and how data occurs and how it is used and how it is useful to the average citizen, which means that the language that we use also has to change, because a lot of the barrier to it is that even the language that we're using in this room right now, is a little bit for my mother, if she was here, she would be struggling a little bit. She'd be writing copious notes, wanting to ask me what is this and what is that sort of thing. And she's an educated person, so you can see that even for educated people, a lot of these concepts are very complex. Then the other thing is that we need to figure out how to demonstrate that data can be useful to people. But that we do by having the correct kind of policies. Teki, myself, Irungu, Tom Morel, who is in the audience, and a few other people have been working on trying to figure out how we can get governments to create the necessary policies. Because if you look at how governments have treated personal data during this period of COVID-19, you just realize that it's very scary. because suddenly there's a story in Uganda where the government found a person through contact tracing, but had shared his data to the police. And the police then arrested him, but not because he ran away for COVID, but because he had not paid his taxes or something. So, so you can see that somehow these sort of things begin to seep across. I was just telling some people early this morning that the one thing that you don't want to happen when government or anyone has your data is for it to get to your wife that you have another girlfriend somewhere else. I mean, that's the most simplistic sort of whatever it is, but you retain the right to not self-incriminate yourself by providing data to one person without knowing how it's going to be used in another place. But how do we get governments to then begin to respect that after COVID-19, or even during COVID-19, that there must be a framework in place that ensures that it restores our data rights as citizens back to us, so that they can tell us, I take your health data, for example, I'm not then going to share that health data and make it public to Medicare company so that they can start selling me insurance because now they know that I have an underlying condition, for example, or whatever. In doing so, we create an environment of trust. We create an environment where citizens actually can see goodness of data in action. And that's the real goal of it. So a number of civil society organizations are working together to develop a declaration that we're going to be taking within the continent, that we're going to be taking to the African Union, that we're going to be taking to UNECA and a few other places, to say, let's actually deliberately create a policy. Let's be ahead of the curve and create a policy that restores citizen data rights and that ensures that even as the pandemic, that whatever data government has on them is actually protected and is safe. So on the 11th of November, we're going to be launching the Restore Data Rights Declaration. And Sarah, I'm going to plug this in here so that everybody who is here can hopefully look out for it and come to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Al. And it's great to see that there's this bringing together of civil society around policy engagement with governments on this topic. Very, very needed. Teki, I'm going to turn to you because as we're having this conversation, it just strikes me what a challenge governments are facing. I mean, if we put ourselves for a moment in the shoes of policy decision makers, they're balancing a rapid digitalization of economies and government services with data protection challenges, global standards, national norms. Oliver has called for an adaptive approach to governance because things are evolving quickly. You can't have a bill that spells everything out that's going to make sense for the next 5 years. So governments have to adapt and learn and reflect. We heard this yesterday also in the plenary for this thematic area. And there's just so much data. And so, you know, if people have to make decisions about how data collected for one purpose is used for another purpose, if at all, it feels pretty overwhelming. And so I am interested, you moved out of government to start the Africa Digital Rights Hub with the idea that you could support governments with policy research and technical support as they grapple with these issues. So tell us a little bit about what that looks like and why is it important, for example, that African policy challenges and debates are informed by African scholarly institutions as they grapple with these increasingly complex issues?
Yes, thank you very much. And I think Al really brought it up, but let me just chip in some reaction to Al and then I'll respond. It's actually related to what I will be speaking about anyway. The challenge is very real, as you have pointed out, and it's not just that. There is no way, we have to be very honest, you know, about these data governance issues. There's no way a government can have one document that solves all the problems. Because the data that we're dealing with is very diverse. and it comes in different forms. It's meant to address different things. So let's even look at the situation of COVID and data, right? There's one set of data which is purely statistical purpose, which is going to be used for the purposes of knowing who is where and what kind of resources governments must give them. This kind of data may be purely statistical data, where how you are addressing it in terms of data governance, in terms of data governance, in terms of data protection, may be very different from data that you are using for contact tracing, which contains personally identifiable and to some extent sensitive data, health data on individuals that must be managed. And so that's one of the challenges that governments really face in all of these things. So there's a broad spectrum of data, and it means that when you're developing all these policies, yes, you can have a global policy statement that says that as a government, I respect data, or I have data governance policies. But when it comes to dealing with the respective issues, it means that you have to develop expertise. And this is where we have challenges with African governments. And not just that, let's even say that we have a regulator, a data protection regulator for starters, that can help us, right? We are seeing a challenge where with our data protection regulators, not all of them are well resourced and well equipped to be able to take this decision. If you even look at some of the global data protection authorities that are out there, they are working closely with the statistical authorities, they are working with industry, they are working with other experts in different fields in order to develop these policies to make sure that the laws are adaptable to the various contexts and systems. And I think for Africa, that is where civil society organizations, things that we've tried to do at Africa Digital Rights Hub, and I keep saying that's why we call ourselves a hub, is that we want to see ourselves as a magnet that then attracts the various people, expertise to the table, whether it means they are volunteering their time, because remember that some of these experts that are needed, right? If you need Mr. Oliver Chigongo, you to get him everywhere. You're not going to get that statistical expert everywhere. So where can we come and converge together, learn from his expertise, adapt it to our respective countries? And I think that is what civil society organizations do best. We are able to speak to all the parties. We are able to speak to the various expertise. So whether it's a statistician, whether it's an IT security person who is building an app that will be used for COVID contact tracing, whether it's another government health sector, you know, that is working with a data protection regulator. We really need to get all of these people around the table to discuss these issues. And I think that a lot of the time governments are overwhelmed, and rightly so, with especially African governments, with, you know, the basic day-to-day challenges that we face, giving people electricity, giving people water, creating an enabling economy for the government. That sometimes takes away from all these things. And civil society organizations such as ours are there to really provide that gap. And I pray and I hope that we really tap into that, because what it then means is that rather than starting afresh with your own research on some of these things, the local civil society entities will be able to look at these research from the local perspective. And that's also very important, because I have seen all these laws that we are adapting, but when you look at the African ecosystem, things play out different. Right? I studied in the UK. I understood the UK data protection law, but when I was forced to implement a similar law in Ghana, I realized that the context will not work at all. So we really needed to adapt to look at our communities, look at our people, look at their level of education in order to engage. And you really need a research that is Africa-centered. And I think that that is what civil societies can also bring to the table, especially on the continent. We know and we understand our context, we understand what works, we know what do not work. And so we should be doing a lot more of these research, and presenting, whether they are toolkits, whether they are reports that provide concrete solutions or recommendations that governments can use, even if it's not formal adaptation. People that are working in governments can quickly use these as reference tools to form opinions, because we're already doing that with the international community and international reports. The only problem is that we don't have a lot of rich Africa-based research around these things. And I think that is where, all of us, Rungu, Al, we can come in and put a lot more of such content out so that it can help the governments on these issues.
Yeah, thank you so much. I couldn't agree more, Teki. And Al, I think you've gotten some guidance from Teki about your Restore Data Rights Declaration. No one document is going to solve all the problems, and how to build in kind of overarching principles, but adaptability and interaction. I think everything that all of you has said so underscores the premise that we started with, which is data governance is a society-wide endeavor, and it is the interaction among all the different actors that you represent, and that including with citizens, that is going to get us somewhere. This is a fluid and somewhat overwhelming set of issues. We have so many questions in the chat that are basically different manifestations of how do you balance? How do you balance between, technical innovation, smart tech tools, and data protection? How do you balance, between security risks, hackers breaking in and actual data use? How do you balance between kind of having sufficient legal oversight, but also enabling countries to respond in emergency situations with data? So as we close here, we've only got about 7 minutes left. Know that everybody in this audience is really interested in this balance and managing trade-offs across the many, many issues that are relevant for this topic. So as we close, I'm going to ask each of you to take 1 minute, really, with this urgency around kind of trade-offs and managing this balancing act in the back of your mind. What do you think is the most important thing that needs to happen over the next 12 months to advance balanced approach to data governance in Africa? You're coming from very different perspectives, but if you can just pick 1 or 2 concrete things that need to happen in the next 12 months that will help kind of people understand how to strike this balance and to manage these trade-offs. Let's just start again with you, Teki, since you're with us, and we'll move back across the continent. Just one minute each, please.
Okay, so these days, and I heard this word first in terms of data protection and data use from the UN Special Rapporteur on Privacy, Synergy. For me, it's about a balance. The first time I heard him explain it, it made a lot of sense to me. It means that everything that matters must be put on the table. And then we make sure that we consider one's opinion in arriving at that synergy. Now, what should happen in the next 12 months polls that we think are critical to ensuring good data governance? Transparency, transparency, respect for human rights should be one of them. Putting in adequate security safeguards may be one of them. But whatever it is that we need to agree on some concrete things that we think are very critical when we are looking at data governance, oversight, for instance. And then let's bring all these things together and start working from there. I think that will be a good start within the first 12 months. And it's fairly easy to agree on what these broader principles will be.
Thank you, Teki. Over to you, Al. How does this build on what you already plan to do? What's one thing that needs to happen?
I think that everything he has said, I'm glad that she's on the steering committee for Restore Data Rights, is exactly right. It's exactly what we need to do. I think that we need to raise the bar on data governance conversations in Africa. We need to understand how the cornerstone principles like transparency, like accountability help. And what we are hoping is that in the work we're doing together, we will get all the support and the voices of the different people around the continent, the different stakeholders around the continent, to actually make a concrete set of agreeable sort of principles to come together and basically begin to work with governments to restore data rights. So if there's one thing I will say is that on the 11th of November, 11/11/2020 is an important date for this conversation.
All right. Primed. Irungu, over to you. Other than 11/11/2020, tell us one thing you think needs to happen.
Well, I think Al needs to put a hashtag on that immediately, right? So we can follow this. I think kind of 4 reflections. First of all, just to say it's been a singular pleasure to be on this conversation. I have a lot, and thank you, panelists, and also thanks for all the questions. I think there are kind of like 3 points. One is that we have to approach this work, like all work, from a power and ecosystems approach lens. I think it's critical to come not from the past, but from an emergent thinking perspective, which is that everything shifts, and nobody knows this better than the techies and the digital folks. So everything that is technological or technical, in our opinion, is also political, and everything that is political also is technical. And I think that will help us to break down these different silos. I think for me, the 2 areas that I'm watching for really, I think, is elections and the increasing use of digital technology in electoral processes, so that people are enhanced in terms of their capacity to vote wisely, but are not disenfranchised or essentially swayed by disinformation. And the last one is disconnected from elections, but it is the same word, disinformation. I think it's really important that we begin to restore the public's faith in the idea that there is truth, there is facts, there are data, they're not alternative facts, there is not different types of data. Yes, there are different opinions, but essentially nothing that, anything that cannot be verified is essentially just that, it's just opinion or an anecdote, and we have to fight back against the tyranny of everything is truthful.
Thank you so much. Okay, over to you, Oliver. One thing that you think needs to happen in the next 12 months.
Thank you. Jackie said something really interesting, that when she finished her school in the UK, she couldn't adapt, or rather immediately use the skills because the setup was different. And part of the reason is some of the issues that have been raised here is that our system on the continent are not digitalized. When you look at the statistical systems, they are not digital. Most of data is collected through traditional means, and this has to change. We, as part of Back Better, we need to transform the national statistical system, the national, the data agencies that are collecting data, if we have to assure issues of accountability, issues of transparency, issues of security. We can only assure that if we have a common platform that allows information to be interoperable and people are able to access. So for me, transforming the national statistical system and agencies that collect data to ensure the issues that Irun, Teki, and Alga are talking about. In the absence of that, we are done, and we have seen it. The national statistical officers were not able to collect information. They closed down because they were used to collecting data in the traditional form. We cannot continue that, so we need to change that in the next 12 months. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oliver. And Aisha, for last words on what needs to happen.
Thank you, Sarah. From my own experience, nothing happens, nothing works without a very robust lead. It is the starting foundation, and without it, just forget about data implementation, data governance strategies. So for me, it's very important, and I have just recently amusingly coined a concept which I call legal pragmatism. And legal pragmatism is when you actually take the principles from your books and them on the ground and make them work. And this is how actually data protection is to be seen today in the African context at the international level. Principles, we have so many principles, aren't they? And very beautiful ones. But are we using all these principles to the max? I mean, are we really, making them work as we should? This is what Teki has highlighted, and all of the panelists here, we're actually talking about the same thing. So what is data governance? Data governance is the management. It's management of the quality and integrity of data, including personal data. Obviously, we're not talking only about personal information, we're talking about all types of data. But it's about management. And management is a principle that we'll learn whilst actually we're dealing with these principles in our different perspectives, in our different working environments. This is data governance, right? So this is where we actually have to assess our own situations and see whether these principles that we are talking about, they match the situation. And if they don't, we just don't use them. So this is what we're trying to do. And that's where I actually say, even in the African context, things can happen. And very beautifully, how? Is that we just learn the basics, what we call the alphabets of privacy. We learn A, B, C, D, and we say, hello, A is just A, B is B. And that's where actually I think things can happen. Thank you.
Oh, wow. We are either just in a management challenge or in a political crisis, and we don't know which. But Al has called us to raise the bar on the data governance discussions, and you have all done that so beautifully today. What a complicated and rich we had another hour to keep digging, but it gives me so much encouragement that the five of you are on this agenda and connected, and having declarations rolling out in the next few weeks. So thank you to all of you, to all of the participants for your rich questions. And I just can't wait to stay in conversation with all of you in the coming years, and for you to stay in conversation with your citizens, each other. Truly, truly a contribution to the continent and to this debate. All of you, thank you so very much. And thank you to the World Data Forum Secretariat, to the Open Institute team, and to all of you for joining us and participating today. May we carry forward bravely on this management challenge and political imperative. Very best for all of you.
Thank you.
Take care.